the Strait of Hormuz is always a study in contrasts. Small fishing boats cutting slow arcs under a sky full of stars, supertankers gathering like sleeping beasts, and on the horizon, the lights of shore installations that make a corridor of human industry out of one of the planet's narrowest waterways. For decades, that corridor has been a barometer of global stability, and today it has become, once again, a focal point for brinkmanship with consequences that ripple from Tehran to Washington, from Dubai to the docks of Rotterdam. In a forceful address timed to National Persian Gulf Day, Iran's new supreme leader asserted a deeper claim to the artery that bisects global energy flows. Since March 8, 2026, the office of Supreme Leader has been held by Mojtaba Khamenei, who was named to the post by the Assembly of Experts following the death of his father Ayatollah Ali Khamenei on February 21st. In his remarks, the new leader framed the Gulf as more than geography, he care, led it an irreplaceable blessing, and described the Strait of Hormuz as both central to the region's identity and a vital artery for the global economy. Those words were not merely ceremonial. They came amid a sharp deterioration in relations after weeks of tit-for-tat strikes and alongside public declarations that Tehran will now implement new management rules for passage through the strait. The substance of those rules has not been laid out in full detail, but the intent is unmistakable. Iran is positioning itself to assert tighter control over maritime traffic, and it is signaling that such measures are a direct response to what it calls repeated aggression by foreign powers. Iranian officials framed their postures as a defense of sovereignty. They accused foreign military presences, above all American forces stationed across the Gulf, of stoking instability for decades. The new supreme leader argued that recent operations had exposed vulnerabilities in those forces sit in Tehran's own missile and drone strikes as proof that regional bases cannot guarantee security. The broader message was blunt. The era of outside powers dictating security dynamics in the Persian Gulf, he said, is drawing to a close. On the other side of the ledger, US policymakers are confronting a very different calculus. Military planners in the region have drawn up options that range from limited, high-impact strikes on Iranian infrastructure to the far more destructive possibility of a prolonged naval blockade of Iranian ports. A blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical choke points, through which nearly a fifth of global oil supplies transit, would be an escalation that could reshape markets and supply chains for months to come. At the White House, public tone has been uncompromising. President Donald Trump, now in his second term, has repeatedly framed the confrontation as one in which the United States must demonstrate resolve. In remarks during a high-profile state dinner, he proclaimed, "We have militarily defeated that particular opponent," and vowed that the United States will not allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. Those words were amplified in diplomatic circles and on trading floors alike. In moments like these, rhetoric becomes policy risk, and markets price in the fear of interruption. Already those disruptions are visible in plain numbers. Oil benchmarks surged as the prospect of contested shipping lanes and the prospect of sanctions or strikes tightened supply expectations. Brent crude climbed sharply above $100 a barrel, trading in ranges that signal to importers and refiners that global energy stability is at risk. At the same time, regional ports are feeling the squeeze. At Chabahar, a deep-water port on Iran's southeastern coast, vessel counts have risen markedly. Where 5 ships lay at anchor prior to the crisis, reports put the number now at more than 20. Merchant traffic stalled as operators weigh their options in the face of possible interdiction or escalation. The human dimension is immediate. Crews on long-haul tankers and container ships are being forced to shelter in neutral waters. Insurers are increasingly reluctant to underwrite voyages through contested passages. Freight forwarders are rerouting cargoes around longer, more costly paths. For many countries that depend on steady oil and gas imports, these moves translate quickly into higher fuel bills for industry and consumers and into a more palpable sense of economic vulnerability. Behind the scenes, USS Military Command has prepared contingency plans for a rapid, targeted campaign designed to degrade specific elements of Iran's military infrastructure and pressure Tehran back to a negotiating table. Those plans, described by officials as seeking to be short and powerful, aim to meet a narrow objective without opening a wider front. But military planners themselves understand the razor-thin line between a carquet, liberated strike and a cascade of retaliatory measures. The risk is that each side's attempt to signal restraint can look indistinguishable from weakness to the other, and that misperception can be what spins the conflict out of control. Iran's military voice on the record has been clear that it does not view the situation as concluded. An army spokesman stated plainly, "In our minds," spokesman stated plainly, "In our minds, we didn't consider the war over just yet." He described a deliberate program of updating Iran's target database during the period of ceasefire and lull, a process he said was designed to ensure that the country can carry out coordinated, precise operations in future contingencies. That same official spoke at length about the synergy between branches of Iran's forces. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, responsible for the western approaches to the Hormuz corridor, coordinating with the formal naval and air defense elements of the regular army on the eastern approaches. This coordination and synergy exists throughout the Strait of Hormuz in all sectors, he said, describing an integrated pattern of aerospace and maritime operations. Those comments expose a paradox at the heart of the standoff. Tehran wants to deter further attacks and to signal capability. At the same time, public declarations make it harder for either side to step back without losing face domestically. In Iran, the leadership is playing to a narrative of historical grievance and regional pride. In Washington, officials are weighing the diplomatic and electoral costs of any course of action. There is a question that haunts the planning rooms on both sides. What happens if a USA-US is a question that haunts the planning rooms on both sides? Administration declares victory and withdraws. Some analysts warn that a premature pullback could embolden hardliners in Tehran and leave unresolved grievances that will fester into new cycles of violence. That calculus is not abstract. Policymakers in Washington are conscious of domestic politics as they shape strategy, a decision to de-escalate. Late may relieve immediate pressures at home, but it can also be read abroad as a retreat that invites further provocation. Conversely, a move that attempts to squeeze Iran economically through measures directed at maritime trade, including the more drastic option of a blockade, would impose heavy costs on global commerce and energy markets, even while it aims to inflict pain on Tehran. The maritime dimension complicates traditional calculations. Unlike a single airfield or a discrete weapons system, control of shipping routes implicates dozens of sovereign states, multinational carriers, and the rules of international law. A blockade, even if framed as limited and temporary, would require naval assets, extensive interdiction capacity, and the diplomatic wherewithal to reassure allies whose trade and energy security would be affected. It would also invite countermoves, convoying, private security, and possible confrontations with Iranian maritime forces that are adept at asymmetric tactics in the narrow, congested waters of the Gulf. For the region, the practical effects are immediate and painful. Gulf states that export oil will see their logistics chains disrupted. Import-dependent nations from East Asia to Europe will feel the squeeze as tanker rates spike and buyers scramble to secure alternative shipments. For companies and consumers, the result is higher energy prices and greater uncertainty about supply. For navies and insurers, the calculation becomes whether the commercial premium of routing around the Cape of Good Hope outweighs the operational costs of running the shorter but contested Hormuz corridor. Diplomacy, meanwhile, is strained but far from absent. International players with strategic interests in the Gulf, from capitals in Europe to Beijing and Moscow, are watching for signs of either de-escalation or deeper conflict. Some are urging restraint and back-channel diplomacy aimed at preventing miscalculation. Others are taking stock of the conflict, our own security postures in an environment that many fear could grow more fractious. There is also a generational element to what is unfolding. A new leadership in Tehran, shaped by a different cohort of advisors and a different private history with the military and security services, will interpret threats and opportunities through its own lens. That has implications for how Tehran evaluates the costs of escalation and the utility of coercive measures. The appointment of a new supreme leader was not a distant bureaucratic event. It was a signal that the axis of decision-making in Tehran has shifted, and that continuity with past policy will likely be refracted through fresh priorities and personnel. As the world watches, the practical choices narrow into a handful of critical questions. Will Iran put its new management rules for the Strait of Hormuz into practice? And if so, how aggressively and against which vessels? Will Washington opt for targeted strikes designed to degrade Pacific Iranian capabilities, or will it opt for broader economic pressure that includes maritime interdiction? And perhaps most consequently, can either side fashion a credible face-saving path to de-escalation that also provides guarantees to regional partners, international shipping, and the global economy? On the ground, the answers are being written in small acts. The rerouting of a freighter around Africa, the extended anchoring of a tanker off a neutral port, the quiet reassignment of a destroyer to the Gulf. Each is a tiny thread, but together they form a fabric of adjustment that could last for months. For civilians in the region, the stakes are immediate. Escalation means more than headlines and market tickers. It means the risk of civilian casualties, refugee flows, and damage to infrastructure that could take years to repair. For the global economy, the question is how long markets must endure the uncertainty of a major supply artery being contested. For political lead, the dilemma is whether to seek decisive action or to manage risk through diplomacy at a moment when domestic pressures and strategic ambitions tug in opposite directions. In the end, the Strait of Hormuz is more than a strategic bottleneck. It is a mirror. It reflects the ambitions and fears of the actors who claim it, and it magnifies the consequences of their choices. The next moves will be watched not just by capitals and trading floors, but by millions whose daily lives depend on the steady flow of energy and goods through those narrow waters. For now, the sea keeps its secrets. Flags fly on distant decks. Crews sit in the long blue hours, awaiting instructions, and leaders on both sides, conscious of the history that brought them to this moment and of the futures at stake, weigh the fragile arithmetic of deterrence, pride, and prudence. What happens next will be the product of strategy and accident, rhetoric, and restraint. The world watches and listens to words that probe, means control, and to the quiet evidence of power amassed or withheld. In a region where symbols matter as much as arsenals, the Strait of Hormuz stands as both prize and peril, and the course selected in the coming days will determine how far that peril spreads.